Welcome to the Dialectic at Work, a podcast dedicated to understanding Marxian theory, its philosophy, its politics, and its economics. I'm your host, Shahram Azhar, Associate Professor of Economics at Bucknell University, and I'm joined by Professor Richard Wolff. So this causality web seems like a mess, right? It's like a mess. How do we unravel? How do we begin to make sense of this jumbled up causality business?
If we want to tell stories, and as I said to you at the beginning, that is something human beings seem to want to do all the time, we're going to have to face that mess without pretending that it isn't there. You have to say, we want to explain something, but we can't. If by explanation we mean to account for why it's there, that requires us to do a job on the over-determination of that existence, which we can't do. A person can't, six people together can't. We will die of old age before we can do it. Okay, so now how are we going to deal with it? If we still want to tell a story, okay, then here's the compromise. You tell a story in which you take a very small number of the relevant causes and you tell the story about them. How did your mother's favorite color and your suitcase's limits of space or whatever you want produce in you the decision to wear the black shirt? And you tell that story. And that's an interesting story. It links an outcome to a set of variables. It doesn't require you to say that it is the truth. It doesn't require you to close yourself off to people who will have an alternative story to tell about your choice of black shirt. And it means for the rest of us, we are going to be interestingly shaped by the variety of stories that people come up with. And we don't have to be frightened by it. Will there be some who come up with a story that is so offensive we'll want to shut them up? Yes, but we will know what we are doing. We are offended by the way they have constructed this game. This has scary implications, and unless those can be addressed, we're going to want to censor you.
So what I'm getting is that to make sense of this mess, you need some point of entry into the analysis, or an entry point, as you call it in your book.
Yes.
So does it follow then that different people are going to have different entry points into the analysis and hence different visions about the world? So there's not necessarily a right or wrong one.
That's right. And I use as examples for help people understand it. You know, you may not take them seriously, which is a mistake, but if you do, there are people who will tell you that the reason there's a war in Ukraine is because God is angry with the Ukrainians or the Russians. Are there people who tell you that story? Yes. Are there people who can tell that story and are sophisticated? Yes. Entry point for us is crucial. That's why we give it the emphasis we do. Overdetermination brings the focus onto, how do you enter? What is the cause you focus on? Because again, that entry point choice, together with overdetermination, tells us what you're trying to do with this story.
It's a kind of strategic essentialism, right? Strategic.
Yes, that's right. It's an essentialism that knows itself to be such. That's a self-conscious essentialism, that it's temporary, that it's imposed on us by the impossibility of explanation, together with a desire to offer explanation that the society imposes on us because it wants explanation, as we do too. So you do the best you can without ennobling it as an absolute. Look, we look back at societies of the past, and this is the truth because it's written in that book, because the Pope said so, because some authority is raised up. And then we discover sooner or later that it wasn't so, that it isn't the only way to look at this, that in fact we don't look at it that way anymore. So if the Pope was wrong then, the Pope could be wrong now. If that book didn't get it right then, the comparable book doesn't get it right. and now it's unraveling on you. We want to take all of that and say, let's put it on the table. An explanation tells you something about the object being explained, and rather more about what's going on by the explanation itself. What is the commitment? What is the goal? What is the political implication of choosing those variables, being so silent? The New York Times never puts capitalism in there as a cause of anything. It shies away. That's revelatory. That tells you that there's something going on that's a project of that newspaper that even they may not understand. They may think this is science we do. Who cares what they think? It's clear from our perspective that there's a very important agenda. Don't look at these variables. And we know it because there's people like us that are saying, don't look at that. They don't want to look at that. Okay, I get that. I get they don't want to. They can't give me that. For me, it was like talking to cement. There was no way to get through it. They insisted that when we talk, we mean to affirm that the causes we talk about are the key important causes, and the ones they talk about aren't. Since that's what they are doing to us, they simply projected we must be doing. That's because the different epistemology was not part of their they didn't do that.
So there's always going to be a power struggle, it seems, between two different truth claims, and there's going to be there in a sense.
Always has been.
Right.
Always has been.
So I want to switch gears slightly. Given this way of looking at anything, basically, or thinking about anything in the world, you examined my shirt at length. I want to ask you the following question. What is Marx's entry point into the world? And obviously you like his work, you agree with his work. Why did you choose that particular entry point? So there's two parts to the question. What is the entry point and why?
I think the entry point for Marx is a bit messy and complicated, but I know that we need to get to a core answer for the moment. That's all. It's just for the moment. It's not the ultimate or anything. I think Marx was outraged by the relationship of the employer to the employee in the production of goods and services. That he understood from all of his work that every society, whatever else it needs, and it needs many things, it needs to produce, distribute, and to consume all kinds of goods and services that are part of the fabric of any society. And therefore, every society has to organize that process. Whether it's conscious of doing that or not is really another matter. But every society has to solve the problem. How are we going to get the goods and services we wish to consume? How do we get them produced and distributed to the consumer? How's that going to be done? Who's going to do it? How is it going to be organized? And so every society does that. Otherwise, it disappears and we don't consider it a society to be understood. And I think Marx was outraged by the employer-employee relationship. And I think I know why. I think Marx was born in the heady aftermath on the continent of Europe of the French Revolution. This epochal event, the end of the 18th century, in which liberty, equality, and fraternity are raised to the level of absolutes, of the point and purpose of human life, and of the necessary basis for human society if it's going to be any good, and particularly if it's going to be better than what existed before. It has to institute liberty, equality, and fraternity at its base and throughout its structure. And he loved that. He believed in that. He thrilled at the negation of slavery implied by that, by the negation of feudal obligations, serf to lord implied by that. And he had this notion, the only way to describe it is to think about it while listening to the last movement of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, the Ode to Joy, it's called there. The freedom, the new free world that we are in the process of building, the heady exuberance, if you like, of the French Revolution. That comes, a little bit later to the mainland of Europe, in Western Europe, where Marx in Trier in Germany, and then so on. And Marx thrilled with all of that, but also looked around him, and he was not the only one who was thrilled by this. Beethoven himself, among others. And he looked around and he saw something which other people saw too, which is that whatever you thought about German society, where he grew up, Marx, or any other European society in the first half of the 19th century, whatever liberty and equality and brotherhood meant, you didn't have it. You had a French Revolution made in the name of those objectives, sworn to bring those to fruition in and for Europe. Failure, failure, failure. What do? How do you? Marx, for me, set himself, again, not the only one. How do I account for this? How do I account for this failure to realize liberty, equality, fraternity? And what do we do about it? I mean, I want to understand it in order to figure out what has to be done to overcome the failure, to actually realize liberty, equality, and fraternity. And his conclusion was capitalism is its own obstacle. The replacement of the master slave, and the lord serf with the employer-employee is not the liberational act they thought it was. Because capitalism, like those other systems, has built into it the negation of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Therefore, to get to liberty, equality, and brotherhood, you have to negate capitalism. You have to end the employer-employee organization of the factory, the office, and the store. Otherwise, you're just tinkering around the edges, and you will fight poverty and never succeed, fight the absence of liberty and never succeed, and fight for the brotherhood you'll never achieve. And therefore, that's Marx, my contribution is to be able to say, I figured out what the problem is, and I figured out the solution.
So the guy is really worried about how we organize work, basically, right? And then he thinks about the surplus.
Again, I don't want to make him more than he was. He figured out how to do that in what was then the workplace. He didn't ask about, for example, some workplaces. His head was the workplace as in the bourgeois enterprise, the factory, most likely. Not so much the countryside, the urban manufacturing. Maybe you could extend it, although he didn't, to the office and the store. But for example, never did he say the household, for example. And so, and that's fine. Nobody does it all. Yep. No thinker has ever covered all the. So, does he miss areas? It's not interesting. It's like saying there are contradictions in Marx. Hello. If you understand Marx, he'd be the first one to tell you contradictions are everywhere. We all learned that from Hegel. So you discovered it in my work. Hallelujah. I can discover it. Give me something you've written that's longer than 2 words, and I'll discover contradiction. I mean, this is...
So one of the first times when I learned Marx, the definition, it's very definitional, as you know. The definition of class that I got was that class is the relationship of a group in society with the means of production or with property relations. You seem to have a critique of that particular notion of class and class analysis. What are the differences between those various theories of class, and why does it matter?
Yeah, because the problem arose because words have multiple meanings. They always do. Sometimes it gets in the way, and then you have to be a little careful. So let me deal with your example directly. A shorthand that became very well known in the second half of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th, and still exists, is the notion that you can summarize or capture in a few words what class means by talking about who does and who does not own the means of production. Well, owning uses the word property, and property is a central concept in modern society, even a pretty important concept in other societies, non modern, and it has therefore been subjected to or infused with all kinds of other meanings, such as, for example, uh, titular authority. I have titular authority means I have the right to exclude you from an object. I have property. That's all it means. I have the power to exclude you. I can do that. I have power over that factory or that piece of machinery or that toothpaste. It really doesn't matter. Okay, well, in a capitalist enterprise, modern one, it is often the case that the people who get the surplus into their hands, the capitalists, don't own anything. The board of directors of many large capitalist corporations, the people on the board, the 15 men and women that are on the board, together own 3% of the shares. So 97% of the ownership of this enterprise is not the people who get the surplus. Because the law is very clear. The surplus, the difference between, roughly speaking, the cost of production and the revenue from selling the output, that accrues legally to the board of directors. Doesn't accrue to the managers, doesn't accrue to the workers. It accrues to the board of directors. Those people receive the surplus that capitalism is about. They then decide, that's a law, how to distribute it. They may distribute some of it to the owners, the dividend on shares, for example. And another part they may use to expand the company. And another part they may use to give themselves tremendous salary. That's their right. What do they have to give the owners? Nothing. What do they have to give? It's entirely in their, or nearly entirely in their discretion. Okay, so strictly speaking, they're not the owners of anything. The owners of means of production are somebody else. Well, you can solve that problem by calling them the capitalists. Okay, but then they're not the ones who appropriate the surplus. They get a distribution. So for me, I don't want a lingo that I find confusing. I want to be real clear, and I can show you in 10 ways how it matters, that I have been able to understand through Marx how the surplus gets produced, by whom, when, where, how it gets appropriated, by whom, when, where, how, and then to whom do the appropriators then distribute it, with what intention and with what results that I expect to be contradictory, developing the system in one way, undermining it in another. That's my job, to show all of that and to show from that why, in my argument, we could do better as a society to organize the workplace differently from this one, given how it works out.
So it seems that there, if you engage with Marx's works across his lifetime, and I think you've kind of answered that already, it's obvious that any great thinker will have these kinds of contradictions.
Yep.
But it seems that you're engaging with Marx's most mature work, i.e., Capital, and your class analysis is focused on the theory of surplus value. Am I right
Right?
in
Yes.
pointing that out? So my question then is, given that you developed this entire class analysis via surplus value, would you then argue, because you wrote a book about this as well, that this can then be used to not only critique existing capitalism, but also our experiments with what you consider state capitalism or others consider socialism? How does that develop? Because I thought that that's really interesting, because then we have a theory that not only criticizes capitalism, but also criticizes experiments within the socialist tradition. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Many people, particularly those not all that familiar with Marxism, are surprised to learn that basically Engels and Marx never wrote about what communism is or would be, might be, and ditto for socialism. That the most important single comment on socialism that they made was the pamphlet in the middle of the 19th century called Socialism, Utopian versus Scientific. And the only reference to communism that most people ever heard of was even shorter work called the Communist Manifesto of 1848. And that these are, for example, the pamphlet is really mostly what is the political program of the very tiny number of people who call themselves communists these days. It's not about the organization of a society. What it proposes nowadays look like a tame list. If you look at the very end of the Communist Manifesto, a tame list of social democratic, the kinds of things half the countries of Europe either have or would happily support. And the Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific, likewise, was a plea for people not to labor under the illusion, as Marx and Engels saw it, that by either imagining or actually creating ideal socialist communities, you would, by the sheer force of your example, move the society beyond capitalism. That they thought was a utopian, like Robert Owens's factories in England or the works of Saint-Simon Fourier in France and so on. They wanted a socialism saying, who's got an interest in capitalism to push the system? Hard-nosed analysis of who we work on with what kind of a program to get them a pretty picture. Now, people have done terrible things with this because what they concluded mechanically was that you should not be interested in utopia. That's, of course, silly. All human beings need a vision of where they would like society to go. Some need it more worked out, some don't. But neoclassical economics, for example, has a vision of a perfect market where there are many buyers and many sellers, and nobody can influence the outcome except by bargaining to reach a general, stable equilibrium. That's a utopian vision, and it motivates them. It leads them to think of the theory of the second best. It leads them to do all kinds of intellectual and practical maneuvers because they have a utopian idea that works its way into their daily life. That's true for everybody. Marxists have utopian dreams, and that's perfectly okay. That's a sad outcome. Why do I tell you this story? Because there's a second sad outcome, and that gets to your point. During the 19th century, as the socialist movement grew, to the surprise of everybody, it grew and it grew fast. Fastest of all in Germany, not so surprising given Marx's influence there, but in other countries too. But in Germany, by the end of the 19th century, we have the second biggest political party in Germany is the Socialist Party. The leader, the great leader at that time in Germany, Bismarck, makes all kinds of overtures to the socialists to work out something because you can't run the society without them. So the socialists are powerful enough that they begin to ask a question they didn't ask before. We are now growing. We are big enough. How are we going to actually make the transition to socialism? We're a political force within capitalism wanting to go beyond. How are we going to do that? Long story short, they came up with an answer. We are going to seize the state. The logic. Capitalism is a movement in favor of employees. Employees are the majority. And we live in a world in which universal suffrage has either been achieved or is on the agenda. The minute we get universal suffrage, we win because we got the majority, the employees. Employers are never more than 2 to 5%, and usually not even that of a society. The United States today, they're counted 3%. Right? So everybody else is not. So and everybody else is mostly an employee or related to one. So this is our chance. We've struggled to get universal suffrage. We have it. Now let's use it to grab the state. And when we grab the state, that crucial agency, the state, which now serves capitalism, will no longer do that. Will be our government serving our interest, which is to go beyond capitalism. So we will focus on seizing the state. And then there's a split. Those who want to do it by revolution and those who want to do it by evolution. Use the vote, use the election process. And, they fight it out. Germany, Edward, forget his name. What? Bernstein, sorry, yes. Edward Bernstein against Rosa Luxemburg and people like that, Karl Kautsky. They fight it out between evolution and revolution. And some countries do it one way. Russia, a little bit later, does it with revolution. They're going to seize the state. The problem is, once you seize the state, which is an enormous and difficult undertaking, which the socialists achieved in many places to this day, you now have to answer the next question. How do you use the state to make the leap? And will that work? Does it turn out that seizing the state isn't necessary or isn't sufficient to do the next thing? And I think it's fair to say that the experience of the 20th century was that seizing the state wasn't enough to make the transition. And so the question became, for the leaders who made the great breakthrough, they seized the state. Lenin in Russia, Mao in China, and so on. They had a decision to do. What we can't make they reached a conclusion. Whether they should have or not is another matter. But they reached a conclusion, we can't do it. So Stalin, the end of the 1920s, basically says, we've seized the state, that is socialism. Lenin did not do that. Lenin in 1921 and 2 and 3, the last years of his life, said, we have seized the state, but I don't know how to. That's only the first step. We have to do more. And he died. We'll never know what he might have come up with. Although I would like to note, people, that he talked about worker co-ops as one of the ways to move forward.
As late as 1923.
Yeah, just before he died. And in China, they've retired into the socialism with Chinese characteristics. And if you look at what they've done, they have taken the state, given it enormous importance, erected a communist party to control the state, which in turn controls the system. In Russia, this meant that the government took over industrial enterprises, owned and operated them. In China, they have a different plan. It's a 50-50 split. Half of the industrial they leave in private hands, both domestic and foreign, and the other half the government runs. So you might think of it as a hybrid between what socialism meant in Russia and what socialism meant, say, in Scandinavia or Western Europe. And this is an interesting development. They have every right to call it socialism. There's no agency that gives you a stamp. You're a genuine socialist. But here's the point I think you want me to get at. When it comes to getting beyond the employer-employee relationship typical of capitalism everywhere in the world, they haven't done that because they've replicated that structure inside the industries that the state regulates and inside the industry that the state owns and operates. And we call that state capitalism, not to diminish its importance or to deny that it has made steps towards less poverty and economic development. The Chinese is the most successful development story we have in the history of the world. Anybody who denies that is self-deluded, is silly. They've achieved enormous things, but they haven't achieved that going beyond. And I believe that if I were to do an analysis of some of their problems, I would find my way back to that being the next step for them. Now, they may be willing to take that step. They may not. That will depend on the state of their struggle with the United States, the BRICS versus the G7 and all of that, just as it affected the Soviet. It'll be time and place and conditions, but they may recognize that. They may not. Pretty soon, if the world is going in the direction it seems to now, when we see more and more state power. Look here, the United States, the government is subsidizing computer chips, and the government is subsidizing electric vehicles and lithium batteries and a whole host of stuff. And you see it in Europe too. They're recognizing that the Chinese combination of private and state is a much more successful growth engine than anything they can do. And sooner or later, they're going to copy that. And that, as that happens, if it happens, then I think the space will grow for those of us who point at the problems of state-private capitalist mixtures. We will have an audience that will say, well, maybe those problems can be solved not so much by varying the proportion of private versus state, that's where the conversation is now, but rather by going beyond. And then we can reconnect with this older tradition.
Rick, I've already taken a lot of your time, but I want to conclude with two questions because they're going to be crucial to our upcoming videos as well. And they deal with two concepts that are very, very critical to the subsequent video series that we're going to do. The first is, because I don't want to lose this and I want the audiences to know exactly what we mean by this term, and that is this term called surplus. What exactly does Marx mean by this term? And because everyone has an intuitive understanding of what it means, but what exactly does it mean and why is it so important?
Okay. There are many ways to get at this, but I'm an economist, so I come out of that, I'm going to have to tilt that way. The whole thrust of classical political economy, neoclassical, what we might call the bourgeois tradition in economics, has been to argue that the production and distribution of goods and services, the economy, is a collaborative effort of three collaborators: land, labor, and capital. The worker who contributes labor, the capitalist who contributes capital, and the landowner who contributes the land. And each of them gets back from the production a share of the output proportional, more or less, to their contribution. And that there is something inherently, Adam Smith would call it harmonious, there is something reasonable about this whole. Nobody is exploiting anybody else. There is no surplus to be fought over. There are appropriate shares, but they're defined by your contribution. So you have nothing to complain about if you get back for your labor, and if you get back for your capital, and if you get back for your land. Okay. They're very old, in various forms, this idea. Marx is a critic of this. Marx rejects this notion, and he rejects it very theoretically profound, in a profound way. He believes it is a mask, a disguise. It understands collaboration as if all three of these were somehow equal. They each had a different thing, but they were equal in contributing. The landowner says, here's the land without which you can't do anything.
He's bringing something to the table.
Yes, the land. And the capitalist is bringing money or machines or factory space or whatever it is, and the worker brings brains and muscles to do the work. So it's collaborative, it's fair, and all of that. And Marx says, no, that isn't. And here's what he means. And I'm going to use an example. Marx doesn't do this, but he provides the reason to do it. Suppose we were looking at slavery. Would you really want to make the argument that in slavery, one part of the work is done by the slave, and the other part of the work is done by the master? Okay, are there people who make that argument? Absolutely. The defenders of slavery, then and ever since, have made the argument that slaves are incapacitated, usually by nature. So if you're a racist, if they're African, so they're African, African. And if they didn't have a European master, they would just roll over and die. But the European master, you see, organizes them so they can produce cotton to be sold to Britain to make the money. So without that, the master takes his share because of the contribution he makes. The problem with this theory is that the master takes it all. In slavery, the master takes it all. You can't make the claim that he does it all, but he gets it all. And he can give it to the slave or he cannot. If there's lots of slaves arriving with no place to go, he can tell his slaves, go over there and die. I don't need you. I have your cousin who's coming over on the boat any minute. So it's hard not to see something else, that the slave produces most of it, if not all of it, gives it to the master. But the master, not being stupid, gives enough back to the slave to sustain the slave so that this game can be pursued tomorrow and next week. But there's a difference between what the slaves produce and what is given back to them for their sustenance. Aha, that's a surplus. Okay. That difference between what some people produce and what they get back, boom, right there is the surplus, because immediately you identify that, you must ask the question, okay, who gets this? Now that I've figured out who produces the surplus, who gets it? And what do they do with it? Become logical question. The same is true with the serf and the lord in feudalism. And so Marx's achievement is to say, look, the same game is going on. Yeah, the employer, the board of directors, which meets 4 times a year in most corporations, usually for a couple of days, in an elegant hotel in one of the major cities, to say that they do comparable to what the 12,000 employees they have do is a stretch. And it's a stretch once you understand how it works. Wouldn't it be safer, better, to say, let's see, can we make sense of the corporation by looking at the employees as surplus producers, the way the slaves were in the story I just told? Let's see how that works. Where is that? Can we identify where that shows up? Can we identify who produces it? Can we identify who gets it? Can we identify what they do with it? And does the whole thing explain the corporation? And the short answer to the question is we did all that. Marx did it, and we've done it again, and others have done it too, and it produces all kinds of really remarkable insights and analyses of the corporation, which is the only justification for doing it. But if you push me, yes, it is a way of thinking about that's what all theories are. If you want to start with the notion it's different groups collaborating, then that's your entry. You're going to make a different sense of this than I am, right? I am not, I can't justify my theory on anything other than look what it tells me, look where it goes, look at the conclusions I draw, look at the political implications, and then you decide, which is in fact what people are going to do. Very few are going to be excited about the internal logic. I mean, some will, and I will do it carefully for them. But it's mostly the larger feelings that come out of this. Will working people feel that they're getting ripped off? My answer my whole life is they already feel that. They don't need me for that. They don't understand why. But here's where I come in. I got an answer for you. You may not like it, but I have an answer for you why you feel ripped off. Why the capitalist is forever trying to cut your salary or replace you with a low-wage immigrant or relocate your job to where the wages are low or automate you out of existence. I can tell you why the employer, who may like you personally, is driven by competition and to do this to you. Why? Yes, you're collaborating. No one denies the employer and the employee have to collaborate to get the job done. But that you have to collaborate doesn't mean you don't have conflict. People, they're very strange. Everybody's family is full of collaboration and lots of conflict. They all know that, but you have to take them through 6 steps for them to understand their workplace is the same story. So don't tell me because you can show that there's collaboration. Yeah, that doesn't mean I can't show you that there's also conflict. And suppose we collaborated under a different system, then we might do something about the conflict too, Jack, right? When people who have a collaboration and a conflict in a marriage, they try to solve, to reduce the conflict, enhance the collaboration. And they try, and they try. And if it doesn't work, they get divorced. And they try again in another relationship. Ooh, and if it doesn't work in capitalism, why don't we try another arrangement? And then I tell them, suppose production were not with employees and employers. Suppose it was a democratic community. That means we reorganize in the hopes that the collaborative will be enhanced and the conflictual will be reduced. And that would make for a better society, and then we would do better than capitalism.
So it seems
9/10 of the working class, and I spend time with working people about this. This is not a difficult sell. It just isn't.
so it seems that when you use the word capitalism, you're not using it in the sense that a lot of people use it in the sense of something that is just free markets, right? You constantly keep bringing the story back to the employer-employee relationship and what's happening inside the farm and the firm and the office.
Yeah.
Why is that important, and how does an emphasis away from markets towards the domain of production, how does that, or the farm or the office, change, or is that something that you got from Marx, or is that your own interpretation? Or
Well, I got it from Marx, but it's also a lot of our work. To be blunt, because I think it'll make it clear, I take the focus on property ownership, private ownership of the means of production, and on markets as definitional for capitalism. To be an urgent attempt to deflect and distract the working class from its conditions. It's a little bit, for me, plays the same role as not referring to the mass of people as workers, but as consumers. What an interesting idea. What an interesting. These people are now to be defined not by the work relationships of their lives, but by the consumer activity of their life. These are very strategic shifts of focus that are the essence of politics, crucial to your politics, but carefully rendered unself-conscious by those who want to get you to do what they want without admitting that they're trying to get you to do what they want. I'll put my cards on the table. I want people to think about that relationship at the workplace, because I think that's the place where the relationships are such that I can show what I want to show and move people to reject those relationships. So that's why I focus on it. I also think, as a matter of history, that the definitions offered by the economics profession are really crude and inadequate. The latest book I've written is called Understanding Capitalism. Be out in a couple of months. It's the companion to the Understanding Marxism and the Understanding Socialism. Here's how I tackle it there. Capitalism is a market system. The trouble with this definition is it doesn't help us to distinguish capitalism from feudalism or from slavery. Slavery had markets. American slavery, for example, had markets, well, to begin with slaves, buying and selling slaves, and then buying and selling cotton or tobacco or whatever it is you had the slaves produce. And at least in the latter half of European feudalism, feudal manors were producing and selling products all the time. So a market isn't the unique thing about a capitalism, because it doesn't give you a boundary between capitalism and not capitalism. So why would you use it? It's very poor as a divider. Here's another one: private enterprise or private ownership of the means of production. Lots of slaves were privately owned by private enterprises in many parts of the world. There's nothing about private enterprises that is distinctively capitalist. What is a feudal manor? It's a private enterprise. It's operated by the feudal family or lord who presides over these villages and these households. It's a private enterprise. It's distinct from the state. It's a little bit like your earlier reference to state capitalism that we talked about, because in slavery, for example, you had privately owned slaves, but the government could and often did own slaves. So you had private slavery and state slavery. Ditto with feudalism. You had private feudal manors with serfs, and you had the state. Louis XIV or Louis XVI in France, the state had its own serfs. So that why do people find it odd, if they do, that in capitalism you have private capitalists and state capitalists? It's the most normal thing that suggests. Why give the state capitalist a name that suggests an alternative system when we know that it doesn't require that because of private and state slavery and private and state feudalism? All right. With all of that, said, it strikes me that the employer-employee relationship has what the market and private ownership of the means of production don't have. Clear boundary. Slavery isn't employer-employee. Feudalism isn't employer-employee. And the socialism or communism to come isn't that either. They are all not that. You don't have one group of people buying the labor power of another. You don't have it in slavery. You don't have it in feudalism. You don't have it in communism of the future. If you understand what we mean by socialism and communism of the future, namely a community, a collective that produces goods and services without any of them being the employer and any of them being the employee, or if you like, all employees are employers and vice versa, a different way of saying the same thing. Well, then you have a nice clear boundary, which, if you weren't ideologically bent, you would prefer anyway, because it's a neater way of understanding. And finally, Marx is full of teaching us to use a phrase called the relations of production. Well, that's what I mean. The relations are, above all, the relationship of employer to, that's a defining, basic, fundamental difference. Then there are relations among employees and relationships among the employer class. But this is the big thing about the human relations that he talks about all the time, and therefore struck me as, again, a good reason to make that the entry point into the conversation.
That's very, very interesting, Rick. And hopefully in upcoming weeks, you'll help us understand Marx's critique in Capital. And hopefully my first question at that point in that video is going to be, if this book is about the surplus, why does the man start with the commodity? And that's going to be my first question to you in that particular episode. All right, guys, I hope you got something out of today's discussion. The Dialectic at Work is going to continue these lovely podcasts, these video series on Marx and Marxism, and in particular on Marxian theory. And Rick Wolff, my former professor and my mentor, is going to help us walk through that particular discussion. I'll see you all next week.